excited to be here and see so many people. It seems like I haven't been out much because of the war, but and then with the presidency. But we'll back up, and I'll start somewhat where you may not be as familiar with Mrs. Washington. And I'll take you back even further than when I was Mrs. Washington, when I was Miss Dandridge. And so I was born in 1731 in New Kent County, Virginia. And my parents had a plantation called Chestnut Grove. And so being the oldest of 8 children, I was expected to help with the younger ones as they came along. So my education was quite hurried because between Mama having the babies, I was expected to help around the house with the children. So I did have somewhat of an education. I learned to do embroidery and how to set up a home, and horseback riding, of course side saddle, dancing, all the things that a young mother and wife would do. But of course I was expected to find a husband first. So all those qualities were something, that I was expected to have to get a good catch. So when I was 19, there was a vestryman in our church whose name was Daniel Park Custis. Now, Mr. Custis was quite a bit older than myself. He was near 20 years older. But my parents felt he would be a very good prospect for marriage because Daniel had vast holdings. He was a tobacco exporter, had over 17,000 acres, somewhere up around 300 slaves. So he was quite the catch to Papa for me, but convincing Daniel's father was something of another story because Daniel had been a bachelor for many, many years, and his father thought that someone who he might have his eye on wouldn't be worthy. But after a few meetings with Mr. Custis, he relented and gave his blessing, and we were married in 1750. I was 19. 1 year later, our first son was born, Daniel Park Custis Jr. Now, there was a catch, and I told you it took a while for his father to warm up to the idea that he would be marrying me. But it was his grandfather who put the conditions on any future children we would have. And the condition was, for every child we had, if they were to inherit the Custis fortune, they had to have the name Park, because it was grandfather Park, in their name. So if you hear a theme to the names of the children, it's because we wanted them to be part of the inheritance. So we had Daniel Park Custis in 1751. And then not long after, we had my daughter, Frances Park Custis. And not long after that, we had my next son, John Park Custis, who we called Jackie. And then we had my daughter, Martha Park Custis, who was Patsy. Now, during the course of having the children, there were, for people who lived in the upcountry, children didn't survive because of malaria, because of some of the childhood illnesses. And Daniel and Frances both died in what we would call infancy. One was 3 and one was 1.5 years. Also, right after I gave birth to Patsy, my husband passed away. Now there I was, a young widow with 2 small children, and it was expected that I would take over the role of plantation mistress. In Virginia at that time, if a woman was a widow and her husband didn't have a will, she could still inherit her husband's property, which is what happened. So I inherited over 17,000 acres. I was the wealthiest woman in Virginia at the time. I also inherited his servants. And of course, the children at a certain age would inherit their portion of the estate. So of course you can imagine that people who were used to dealing with my deceased husband were quite surprised when I wrote letters and said, now you will be dealing with me. If you would like to purchase tobacco, you will have to deal with Mrs. Custis. So it took a while for the men to acclimate to having to deal with a lady instead of her husband. Of course, one of the things, being a young, available, and young widow, and quite wealthy, was the suitors who came to call. Now, the plantation where we lived was called White House, and it was near Williamsburg. So men would come to the city, and then they would come out to call on Mrs. Custis. Of course, there weren't really anyone that caught my fancy, and the first time I married, it was more to please Papa. The second time, I knew it was going to be to please me, and I didn't have to worry about the catch. I was going to marry for love. So wouldn't you know, this young, attractive, military gentleman named George Washington came calling. It was during social season in 1758, and I had only been a widow less than a year. And after my period of mourning had passed and the men started to come call, Washington thought, well, I better get my name in the ring because she won't be around much longer. So he came to visit, and of course, I felt that he was quite attractive. His red hair, his blue eyes, and of course he was a military man. And that was quite impressive to myself. So after he and I had spent a couple of meetings together, he went back to join the war that was going on during the French and Indian War, and left me to my own devices, which we had discussed that we were fond of one another, to which I took, it was an engagement. So I proceeded to order my wedding dress. That, of course, it needed to be conservative, but not grave. I didn't want to be in mourning again. So I ordered a beautiful gold damask gown with a white petticoat with tiny silver threads running through the petticoat. And my shoes that I ordered from Paris were purple with little satin beads, or little crystal beads on the satin. And of course, it had to be arriving in time because I knew he would be coming back soon. So during the Christmas season, when he had returned to Virginia, we set our wedding date for the 6th of January. So only a couple of weeks. And of course, all of the finery had arrived, and Mr. Washington, Colonel Washington, was in his blue velvet suit and blue buckles on his shoes, and he cut quite the sight. And of course, everyone wanted to come to the wedding because it was the social event of the year, as you can imagine. And so as soon as we were married, Mr. Washington resigned his military commission and set about getting his home ready, which was called Mount Vernon. Now that was also, he didn't actually own Mount Vernon when we first met. He was actually renting it from his brother's widow. And then once she passed, he inherited it. So then he was given full reign to get that house ready. Now, I'm coming to Mount Vernon with 2 small children, a 3 and a 1-year-old. So you can imagine, well, almost 2, that he has to get in papa mode pretty quick because I'm used to running the show and the whole kit and caboodle at White House, and now he is going to be setting fairly well because he is going to get the widow's third. And he was not only going to get the money, which he would share with me, he would get the dower slaves, and he would also get any investments that I controlled. Because once I married, things changed. I was no longer head of the household, but because of the Custis part connection, they would always be considered Custis slaves, even though they were controlled by George Washington. So, once we were married, and he took on the role of Papa, he took on the role fully. And one of the things that particularly struck me of how much he loved children was the first book that he showed the children. I'll pass it around, you can look at it. It was called The Pretty Little Pocketbook. And President Washington, later, George Washington then, loved to read this book. And while he was in Williamsburg, because he was part of the House of Burgesses, he picked this little book up that he had read when he was younger and wanted to share it with Jackie especially, because the little boy in the book is Little Master Jack. And so, or Tommy, but it's about Jack and the Beanstalk later. And so there's things in that book that he wanted the children to learn, especially honesty. And one of the things, that character that George wanted the children to learn was honesty is the best policy. Now, I had come from a family who my mother said, you know, there's a key to a happy life. And you should be busy as a bee, cheerful as a cricket, and steady as a clock. Whereas coming from the Washington side, it was duty and it was honor, and of course, country later. So the children adored their papa, absolutely adored their papa. And of course, once Jackie reached the age of 6, he could get his first pair of breeches. And it was quite the big event. And so he and his papa chose a new pair of knee breeches, and he was no longer considered an infant. So he got out of his dress at 6 years old and could wear knee breeches like his papa. So after a few years of bliss living at Mount Vernon, I know you're familiar with things that happened in the country. And of course, we were living and were quite comfortable with the situation as it was for many years, being subjects of the crown. But then things changed, and we noticed that the British crown was expecting more out of the citizens of Virginia, and things that were happening in Boston had become known to those of us in Virginia. So as you know, once the fighting at Lexington and Concord broke out, people started to see that there would have to be a revolution for us to gain our independence from the British crown. Now, Governor Dinwiddie was also nearby. We had dined with Governor Dinwiddie. We knew Governor Dinwiddie. But we also knew that anyone who opposed the British were traitors to the crown. So once the Continental Congress started to meet, and George had to go to be part of that, he was quite concerned for my safety because Governor Dinwiddie could have kidnapped me for a ransom. And so that was always a concern. And once the war did break out and he was chosen to be commander of the Continental Army, he told me, he said, "Now, Martha, I'm not going to be here. You're going to have to manage the estate. But as soon as it's able, I want you to come and stay with me. But before you can come, there's something you have to do because it won't be safe." Can anybody tell me what she had to do? She had to get inoculated for smallpox. Smallpox. Now, George had had smallpox. When he and his brother Lawrence were in Barbados, they both had contracted it. And so, of course, And I'll pass this around so you can see. As a young man, I could see the scars on his face, and I knew what they were from. But I had never had smallpox. My face was white, very delicate and protected from the sun. And so he told me, he said, if you're going to come and stay during the winter months, you have to be inoculated, which was very scary for me because I had these 2 children. And of course, I was concerned about that. By now, Jackie and Patsy were growing up, and we had found out that Patsy had seizures. Fits is one of the things they called what she had. And Patsy passed away at 16. And when she passed away, it was one of the lowest ebbs of my life. And so during that time, I think George was really concerned for my mental well-being, and that getting away and joining him was the best thing for me. So that's what I did. I got inoculated, and I went right into the camps. There were 2 other officers' wives whom I became very good friends with. One was Henry Knox's wife, Lucy, and then Kitty Green, Nathaniel Green's wife. And the 3 of us would go to the camps during the winter to stay with our husbands. And the soldiers especially were quite glad to see refined women to show up in the camps. Now, I'm excuse me when I say this, but there were women who were of ill repute that would come to the camps. Some were laundresses, some cooked for the soldiers, and then there were those that I had spoken to George about many times and said it really wasn't good for the morale of the soldiers if these women of low morals were congregating outside of the camps. But the soldiers were truly, truly happy to see Lady Washington, is what they would say when I would come into the camps. And of course, to get to the camps, usually in the winter, I would have to go by sled because the snow was so deep in some of those camps. And during the war, I went to every single camp I was able to stay with George. So one of the places particularly that I remember fondly, many of the soldiers would not, and that was Valley of the Forge. During the time leading up to the winter there, we knew that the soldiers didn't have provisions. Thankfully, there were Indians who lived nearby who brought food. Some of the Quakers in Pennsylvania had brought food for the soldiers during that time. But the snow especially, where they didn't have shoes, a lot of the people who lived in the area called it the winter of the red snow because the soldiers had to take their hats off. And I'm sure you've heard of Baron von Steuben, who was brought over from Germany to whip those soldiers into shape. And he would have them out there drilling, even in the winter. And they would be so cold, they'd be standing on their hats. Of course, they wanted to be, because sitting around, you'd freeze to death. But that snow, I remember coming in and seeing the red snow where the soldiers' feet were cracked and bleeding. And so I had brought bandages. We wrote letters home to their wives or their parents. And we sewed their uniforms for them. One of the things they enjoyed is we sang with them. My children were expected to play a musical instrument growing up. And of course, Patsy had her harpsichord. And then Jackie had a little guitar. And also they were expected to play violin. And so some of those instruments at Valley Forge, we did bring a flute and some other things. And some of the soldiers played on those and sang. And after Saratoga especially, at that camp, Colonel Washington said, I really want you to make something. I want you to set your needle, and I want you to make something for the soldiers. They've been through so much. And of course, after the Battle of Saratoga, the turning point of the war, when Washington thought he was going to lose all of his men, those men stayed with Washington, and they wanted to fight with my husband. So he said, when you set your needle, cut out something in a heart, and I want you to make it out of purple material. And I want you to fashion something that says meritorious valor. And I want you to cut that, and we're going to give those to the soldiers because of the winter at Valley Forge in Saratoga and all of the things that they had done to show their love of country. And today I believe there's a name for that. I think it's a Purple Heart. Yes. So that started with General Washington at that time. So the war continues on, and my son Jackie, and he's married at this time, and I have 4 grandchildren. And during the war, he decides he wants to help his papa. And he is an aide-de-camp. Now, an aide-de-camp is something of a secretary, and he keeps track of the pay, and he keeps track of who was injured in battle, and those types of things. But he waited until almost the very end of the war because they were going to Yorktown. I mean, he got in at the very end. On the way to Yorktown, I had gone back to Mount Vernon, and the Marquis de Lafayette stopped in to visit and make his introductions. And I was quite impressed. He almost reminded me of our Jackie, about the same age. Of course, thankfully, when the Marquis came, he brought his money as well and helped to fund our the war effort. But on the way, Jackie had been at the surrender, and then he contracted something called camp fever. Now, his wife, Eleanor, and I were going to see my son and my husband at the end of the war because we were allowed to come in and visit. And we got there just as he took his last breaths. He had made it to the very end, and now he left behind a young widow with 4 small children. Now, the 2 oldest girls, Eliza and Patsy, they stayed with their mother. But she asked me if I would take the younger 2 back to live with General Washington and myself. And those 2 children were quite the Spitfires. Her little girl, Eleanor, who we called Nellie, she was quite fond of her grandpapa. And then the little boy, who was the apple of our eye, because we had granddaughters. We didn't have grandsons until little Washi. And his name was George Washington Carter, or Custis, Park Custis. And we called him Washi because he was so much, we thought, like General Washington. And I can remember him coming back with those 2 children, and it started all over. He was becoming papa to these 2 small children. And we thought we would just raise those children there at Mount Vernon. He was taking them on horseback rides, and I remember he had these hounds that he was quite fond of. Pets were always part of our lives. My favorite pet was my parrot, Polly, and Polly went everywhere with me. One of the ship captains had brought that parrot back, and General Washington had brought the parrot back to me not long after Patsy had passed away. And so I always had parrots, but he liked hunting dogs, and he named them the most obnoxious names: True Love, Sweet Lips. You can imagine hearing him calling these hounds by those names. And I can remember we had guests for Christmas, and I had brought in, well, I had asked that the servants bring in a large ham, and there was my Christmas cake, and all of the vegetables, and I left the room to attend to the guests. And when I came back, Sweet Lips had his lips all over my ham and had dragged it off the table, silver platter and all, and out the door he went. Well, I was beside myself. Of course, there was General Washington, belly laughing, thinking it was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. So he did have a good sense of humor. I, on the other hand, as some people would say, my tongue could cut a privet hedge because it was quite sharp when it needed to be, especially when we talked about that man Jefferson. But that comes later. But the country had won the war, and for a very short time we enjoyed being at home, but duty called again, and the country needed a leader. So they came and spoke to my husband and said, it's unanimous. We want you to run for the president, which at that time they didn't exactly know what they were going to call him. But we want you to be the leader of the country. And he couldn't say no. And he said, it's something we owe the country. We need to do this. So once again, after he was elected unanimously, he packed up and he went to New York. And once again, I had to pack the children and the servants, and off we went to New York. Now, Nellie thought New York was grand because she had not been off of the plantation very much. She was educated. We had guests. Guests came to our house almost 325 days out of the year. So we constantly had guests. Some of them would come to the door, and Billy would come and say, you know, Master Washington, so-and-so is here, and here are their introductions. Never heard of them. But we had friends of friends who said, when you go through, you need to stay at Mount Vernon and meet General Washington. So we always had guests. And Nellie met some pretty interesting people, as did Washi. But when we got to New York, they wanted to attend plays and have culture. So we did. I, on the other hand, felt very trapped. I felt very trapped, like a prisoner almost. The home that we had was on number 3 Cherry Street. And of course, we were used to Mount Vernon. And the streets in New York sat above the entrance to your houses, the way they built the streets. And so then they didn't have a place for us to live yet because they were still building Washington. So we were in New York until a time when they could move the government further south. So New York and Cherry Street, I always get a chuckle because the women wore hats, but they wore hats bigger than these. And when they came to visit the president, who was also tall, the chuckle was that when you came in to talk to the president, you better duck your head, as he had to do, because the door, if you had hats, but also it was dangerous. Anybody guess why it would be dangerous to come in and visit the president in 1790 or 87? Anybody know? Okay, look above us. Exactly. So number 3 Cherry Street was known for the great hair explosion of one of the ladies that came in to visit because she had her hat from Paris that went on for miles, and when she came in, she forgot to duck, and when she made her introductions, her hat caught on fire by one of the candles. So of course, her hat was swooped off her head and stomped on the ground, and it was quite the scene. That was probably the only thing about New York I enjoyed, truly. That was it. So, of course, we weren't there very long, and we moved to Philadelphia for a time where the capital was. And I loved Philadelphia. I truly did. I loved the people. I loved the the theaters, the plays. The children were quite happy. And for 2 terms, the children saw dignitaries, and they saw people who, they wouldn't have met at Mount Vernon. And one of the people, again, that they were quite taken with was Marquis de Lafayette. And one of the things he did before he went back after the war, he stayed around a little while. He went to Bunker Hill, Breed's Hill, and he wanted to get a bucket of dirt. All right. Weird, but that's all right. So he got a bucket of dirt, and then he said, before I go, I want to come and see Mount Vernon. And of course, he presented the key to the Bastille to President Washington. But he also wanted to get dirt from Mount Vernon. So he got a bucket of dirt from Mount Vernon. And he went back home. And I never knew what he did with that bucket of dirt, or 2 buckets. But I found out later that he wanted those buckets so that when he passed away, he would have a bucket of each of the 2 places that meant the most to him in America put on top of his casket as they lowered it in the ground. So those things, and of course we had the key to the Bastille hanging by the door, so it was pretty even trade. I think a couple buckets of dirt for that, and of course all the money that he brought with him when he helped with the war. That was a plus. So, that being said, we come back home and are able to enjoy not having to be on call to the country, to enjoy time to just relax and have company and visit. And the children started to grow up, and of course they adored living with us, but of course they married as well and moved away. And we always had people coming to stay. My nieces, his nephews. In fact, my niece married his nephew. And so it was quite the family affair. But of course, President Washington did not get to enjoy his retirement as long as we had hoped. And so one afternoon he had gone out with his dogs, and it was starting to get cold. It was December, and it was quite chilly. And he went out to check. He liked to check the pastures and just ride and be by himself. And he came back in that evening, and he said his throat felt particularly scratchy, sore, and he took to his bed. And of course, I had Billy bring in some hot tea. We called the doctor to come and to bleed him. And of course, he said, we've done everything we can do. There's nothing else we can do. And his throat did start to constrict from the ailment that he had contracted. And he did pass away in December of 1799. Of course, when he passed away, I had just decided I had gone through everything I needed to go through. My trials were over. I was ready to go as well. But I also worried because when George passed, we had different views on slavery. George inherited the use of my slaves. The slaves that were his were to be freed upon his death. He never really wanted to keep slaves, but because I had inherited the dower slaves, it was part of our inheritance for the children, and so we kept them. But when he passed away and he wanted them freed, I still had the Custis slaves. And the children said, Mama, you need to, or Grandmama, you need to free the slaves because you're not safe here. And several of the slaves had talked about leaving, or there was some undercurrents that maybe they would try to do something. So Martha freed the slaves. The ones who she didn't emancipate, that had to go to Custis heirs, went to Washi and to Nellie's heirs, and they would have to decide that. And then, step out of character for a minute, Martha passed away May 22nd, 1802. So she was just 70 when she passed. So not very old, but in those days she lived a long life. One of the things that the granddaughters of Martha found were a few of her letters, just a few. Before she passed, she went into her bureau and she took all the letters out that she had exchanged with President Washington, George Washington. All through their courtship, all through their marriage, she had saved those. And she burned them. When they were moving furniture, much, much later, they found back in the bureau some letters. I think there were 2. And it gives you a really clear picture of how Martha and George were more than companions. And they were more than these 2 people that got together because of the times that they were together. It was a love story, and he was quite smitten with her, and vice versa. I mean, they didn't want to be apart. And, you know, they considered each other worthy companions of each other. So that was very private to her, were those letters. But we do see some of those letters. And he also wrote letters. And he called her Patsy. That was her nickname with him. Even though she had a Patsy, he called her Patsy as well. So if you go to Mount Vernon, as I've seen in the last few weeks, they're opening up new rooms. Martha never slept in their bedroom again. After George passed away, she moved up to the 3rd floor. And that's where she stayed until she died. She did not want to be in that room any longer. It is said that one of the people she most detested was that man Jefferson. And she never got over him leaving the presidency, walking away over the deal with Hamilton, giving him a little more advice than what she felt Washington, because she was right in there. I mean, she was on that cabinet whether we knew it or not. She put her 2 cents worth in, and she never got over it. So she didn't mince words. She complained quite a bit when he became president, so. All right, so is there anything that you're interested in knowing that maybe I could help and tell you, or? Yes?
What kind of humor did President Washington enjoy?
He loved a good practical joke. And a lot of people don't know that about him, but around the house, at Mount Vernon, he was always kind of, playing tricks on her, kind of jumping out, and of course the dogs, he would let them get in on the bed. I mean, he was at home. When he was at home, anything went pretty much. He was quite happy to be at home, and so he was quite relaxed. But he did have a good sense of humor. And one of the things that Martha always talked about is he had a good appetite. Even though he had problems with his teeth, he loved to eat breakfast. That was his favorite meal of the day. And he always wanted hoe cakes, and he wanted them just slathered in honey and butter. Those were his favorite things. I know, favorite things. So, yeah, good question. Yeah.
When the wives would go to camps, where did they stay? Did they have to stay in tents or
Okay.
log houses?
Most of the time they were in homes. At Valley Forge, they had a house, a 2-story stone house. And so Martha stayed in a pretty good accommodations. Now, Washington had a tent that he took with him. And I was trying to think before I came what the dimensions of his tent were, because they have it. You can see it. And it's quite large. I mean, he wasn't living in a pup tent. It was cold. It was cold. And, of course, they had their little feet warmers but it was cold. But now she just toughed it up and stayed right there with him. And she stayed the whole winter until it was time to go. And when the camp moved, she moved back to Mount Vernon. So,
Is there any truth to the shed on the Schuylkill River that saved the Army from starvation?
that I don't know if it's true or not. I've heard that before, but I don't know if it's urban legend or what have you heard?
Well, there was a shed run. The Army was starving at Valley Forge, and there was a shed run that spring in the Schuylkill River. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Schuylkill, but Schuylkill's how it's pronounced there, I believe. Yeah, fish. They had a run up that river, and it saved
Like
the
salmon.
Army from starving.
So they just grabbed the fish.
Yeah, just grab it. Yeah, I've heard that, but I don't know for sure if that saved it. But I mean, it was there, and they could eat that. I do know for sure that the Indians brought them food, for sure, and I know that the Quakers. And the reason the Quakers did, and this is kind of, because the Quakers, as you know, they're pacifists, and they would not fight. And so Washington had a lot of them rounded up and put in jail because they would not fight. Martha, at one of the camps, met two Quaker wives. And they came and they said, will you, the lowdown, will you talk to your husband? Because our men are in a prison and we don't believe in that. That's our religion. And they appealed to Martha because she was quite religious. And so she bushwhacks it over to where her husband is with General Knox and General Greene and, get over here, we need to talk. And she asked him, would you please do something about these men who have left wives at home with children? It's winter. They need to be home with their families. And he sent word. Now, he didn't do it, but he sent word to go get those men out of prison so they could go back to their wives. So in turn, I think that's probably why the Quakers sent food, because they had helped with the food. So the women, they get it done. Right. Yep. Good question. Yeah.
I have a question. If I'm not mistaken, the mansion at the top of the hill at Arlington Cemetery is known as the Custis Lee Mansion.
Yes.
So who was the Custis and who? I know the Lee was the Robert E. Lee family.
Okay. So Mary Custis was a granddaughter of Martha. And through Washi. And that was her family's home. So when Lee and she married, that became their home. So Arlington House would have stayed in that family had it not been for the war and then the Yankees coming in. So yeah.
She was a granddaughter there.
Granddaughter.
And she married Robert E. Lee, or one of the Lees?
Robert E. Lee. Mary.
Yeah, because remember, the seizure of Arlington House by the Union government. I know you guys don't like the Union and so on, but that's okay. But the seizure of that is what is now Arlington National Cemetery.
Right.
A lot of people don't know that.
That was the plantation, right?
Correct.
And the whole idea, I'm going to add, was to punish the Lees. And to punish Mrs. Lee, they buried the soldiers in her rose gardens.
The very first,
Not a good thing, right? So that was
Custis Lee later successfully sued the federal government for redress or whatever you want to call it, but he won in court.
trespassing. I don't know what you would call it, but
He won the money in court. Like
Yep.
$100 and some odd thousand. I don't know what that would add up to.
yeah, back then that was a lot of money, right?
That was a big plantation. That's a huge.
Yeah, it was beautiful. And when you're standing up there and you can look out and you can see all of, Washington, it's crazy how much land they had. So,
Nice
question.
view, too.
I know, it is a pretty view. Anybody else? Anything?
Thank you.
Did you really throw a silver dollar?
No, and he didn't chop a cherry tree down either. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.